Yeah. Ooh, yeah. I am woman, hear me roar. Numbers too big to ignore. And I know too much to go back and pretend.
And Marbury Hutchinson, the mother of 16 children, was the first American woman to fight for religious liberty even though it led to her imprisonment and banishment. The first to hold religious discussions for women in her home, she is the inspiration behind the Women's Missionary Society in America. On August 18, 1634, she left England with her husband William Hutchinson and her children, in search of religious liberty. During her 9-year residence in America, until her death in 1643, she suffered intolerance and religious persecution. She established 3 homes. The first was in Boston, but she was forced to move to a second at Portsmouth, Rhode Island, and a third near what is now Pelham, New York. Her banishment to this third wilderness, the Dutch settlement of Verdeland, resulted in her death and that of 8 other members of her household in an Indian massacre. And Hutchinson grew up in England, and worshipped in the established church. Her father was a minister, who received his license to preach soon after his graduation from Christ College, Cambridge. He was an independent thinker, and a man who would scorn to withhold his views for the sake of expediency. Even during Anne's childhood he was called before the ecclesiastical court, condemned for his unorthodox preaching, and cast into prison. Upon his release he was forbidden to revisit his former parish at Northampton, England, but he still refused to bridle his tongue, and he was tried and convicted again. This time he was unfrocked. As a girl, Anne was caught up in the religious resurgence that followed a plague in 1603, when the people turned to the church for consolation. She had inherited her father's deep sincerity along with his determination to follow only the spiritual path that was revealed to him. She was destined to suffer for this integrity, but she was to carve for herself a unique place in history as a prophetess, spiritual healer, and unwavering and dauntless fighter for religious freedom. In 1612, in the ancient St. Mary Woolchurch in London, Anne married William Hutchinson, a dealer in textile fabrics. They went to live in her husband's town of Alford, Lincolnshire County, England, which remained her home for the next 21 years. During this time she gave birth to 14 of her children, only one of whom died in infancy, an unusual record for those times. Long before she arrived in America, Anne broke with the established church. She did not confine herself to one minister, but went about listening to many, always searching for the truth. Later she declared, "The Lord did discover to me all sorts of ministers and how they taught." At the same time, she studied avidly the authorized King James Version of the Bible, published just a few months before her marriage. She was profoundly influenced by discussions on antinomianism, which opposed legal rules in favor of obedience to the Spirit, a doctrine preached in parts of Germany during the Reformation. Her group declared that, "Just because you observe the letter of the law is not proof that you are good in your heart." And Hutchinson was a spiritual-minded believer, and her own blameless life testified to her sincerity of purpose. Her spiritual exaltation generated enthusiasm, and many looked upon her with admiration despite official disapproval. She was a devoted follower of John Cotton, former vicar of St. Botolph's Church in Boston, Lincolnshire, England. She sought his counsel many times, and he respected her. And thought of Cotton as a faithful, sincere friend, and she and her entire family expected to sail to America with him in 1633. When she found she was with child, she decided to wait until the next summer, but her son Edward made the voyage with Cotton. Because of these close family relationships, Anne was deeply shocked and hurt when Cotton later turned against her, and joined her Massachusetts accusers. Unable to find religious tolerance in England, Anne felt confident it must exist in the New World, so she migrated to America with her husband. Her 15th child, born in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in March of 1636, was given the biblical name of Zuriel, meaning, "My work is God," indicative of his mother's love of the Bible. Anne became influential in Boston, then a farming town with a population of about 1,000, and she opened her home to large masses of women. It is estimated that as many as 80 overflowed to the doorsteps of her farmhouse at the corner of Washington and School Streets, opposite the home of John Winthrop, colonial governor. Here friends and neighbors gathered for her religious discussions. Others beat a pathway to her door, and she brought physical as well as spiritual healing to many, especially sick babies. The women, faced with tribulations in the New World, found in Hutchinson calm assurance. The spirit within, she told them, controls the right actions of man. He who has God's grace in his heart cannot go astray. It was common to hear her admirers remark, "Come along with me. I'll take you to a woman that preaches better gospel than any of your black coats that have been at the university, a woman of another kind of spirit who has had many revelations of things to come." Her growing leadership among Boston women, however, created jealousy and animosity. Some considered it disturbing to have women gathering for an exchange of religious views. This Hutchinson woman, they said, who took part in theological discussions, and voiced her protests quite freely, was a contributing cause to the spread of dangerous doctrine. She called some of the clergy a company of legal professors, who lie poring over the law which Christ had abolished. In December of 1636, a group of these disgruntled ministers called at her house. Among them was her English minister John Cotton, but he let the others do the talking. She held her ground with them, but her frankness in speaking out led her into serious trouble. Her harshest enemies compared her with that woman Jezebel, which calls herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants. Her friends, however, thought of her as a Priscilla, who expounded unto Apollos the way of God more perfectly. Certainly, she was trying to expound the way of God more perfectly to her classes. These women, among whom she had her largest following, could not come to her defense, for they had no public vote, and Paul's counsel against women speaking out in the churches was narrowly interpreted, and harshly applied. The minister's explanation of the verses was a contradiction of Christ's teaching that men and women are equal before God, and asserted that Paul was speaking not to all women in churches, but to the young women at Corinth, who had worshipped in pagan temples, and who had not gained sufficient experience to assume church leadership. When and voiced further protests against the literalism and bigotry of the Massachusetts Puritans, and the intolerance of the clergy, she added fuel to their resentment, and her enemies began to unite against her in earnest. Here was a mere woman who believed in the direct control and guidance of the spirit within. They justified their condemnation by saying she might lead others to consider themselves superior to laws, both moral and civil. A synod of ministers was called at Newton, Cambridge, to discuss Hutchinson's case. She was tried there in a gloomy church during the cold days of November 1637. This lonely woman of 46 walked valiantly down the aisle in her blue Puritan frock, with white fichu, and cuffs, and her blue bonnet, with its wide band of white. Slight in build, unusually attractive, and magnetic, she calmly took her place on the stand. Intelligent, refined, and keen of wit, she made an effective witness, as she stood before her judges, to defend the fundamental right of free worship. Her family did not go with her to her trial. Her husband, deputy to the General Court of Massachusetts from May 1635 to September 1636, and judge of the district court, no doubt trusted in her own ability. Already disgusted with conditions in the colony, she may have induced him to stay at home. He could have had no idea of the dangers his wife faced. During the proceedings, Anne asked, "Why should I be condemned? I conceive there is a clear rule in Titus that elder women should instruct the younger. When I was in Old England," she continued, "I was much troubled at the constitution of the churches there, so far troubled indeed, that I would like to have turned separatist. But the Lord revealed himself to me that I must come to New England, yet I must not fear or be discouraged. And the Lord said, I will not make a full end of thee." In these words she disclosed the fact that she had received revelations from the Lord. Her inquisitor demanded, "How did you know that it was God that did reveal these things to you and not Satan?" She hastened to reply, "How did Abraham know that it was God that bid him offer his son? I, too, knew by the voice of his own spirit to my soul." She was placing herself too high, her enemies thought, and the court condemned her. Governor Winthrop, who made the announcement, declared, "You are now banished from our jurisdiction, as being a woman not fit for our society." Anne persisted, "I desire to know wherefore I am banished." The governor answered, "Say no more, the court knows wherefore, and is satisfied." Quoting to them the 6th chapter of Daniel, she reminded her accusers. Then said these men, "We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel except we find it against him concerning the law of God." Pointing to her enemies, she declared, "It was revealed to me that they should plot against me, but the Lord bid me not fear. Take heed what you go about to do unto me, for I am in the hands of the eternal Jehovah, my Saviour. The bounds of my habitation are cast in heaven. Take heed how you proceed against me, for I know that for this you go about to do to me God will ruin you, and your posterity, and this whole state." This statement angered her accusers. She was declared guilty of keeping 2 public lectures every week in her house, and for reproaching most of the ministers, excepting Mr. Cotton, for not preaching a covenant of free grace. Her penalty was 4 months' imprisonment, but since the colony did not yet have a prison, she was committed to the home of a relative of one of the ministers who had accused her. Her husband, and other disillusioned residents made plans to leave Massachusetts Bay, rejoicing that they could depart from a colony so narrow in its views. In March 1638, she was asked to appear in her own First Church of Boston, on the charge of holding unorthodox opinions. Settlers from far and near, even Governor Winthrop, crowded into the little church to watch the proceedings. But Anne's main supporters, the women she had taught, were not there, for some were already banished, some had left in disgust, others were afraid to appear. Accompanied by her son Richard and her son-in-law Thomas Savage, she proceeded down the church aisle, a picture of womanly dignity. "Sister Hutchinson," spoke the presiding elder in reading the admonishment, "here are divers opinions laid to your charge, and I must request you in the name of the church to declare whether you hold them, or renounce them as they are read to you." After he had read the long list of her alleged heresies, she argued the points, maintaining that the Bible supported her views. As more texts were quoted, she became irritated, and made some biting retorts, which her accusers immediately characterized as too forward, especially since she was a woman speaking to church elders. As the evening wore on, and only a fourth of the opinions had been covered, one of the elders proposed that she be admonished on the subject so far discussed, but this required a unanimous vote. Her pastor John Wilson spoke out boldly against her to the assembly. A censure of a member was supposed to have the unanimous support of the church. But since her admonishment was opposed by her faithful son and son-in-law, one of the elders proposed that they be eliminated from the right to vote. John Cotton rebuked them in stinging language. Anne's son Richard became so disillusioned with the new colony that he soon sailed to England, never to return, and her son-in-law left Massachusetts Bay for Rhode Island. She, however, continued to fight her battle. When the time for the 3rd examination came, her husband and other members of her family had already gone to Rhode Island to set up a new home to which she could turn when her trial had ended. During her final day in the Boston church, Pastor Wilson, misinterpreting a statement she had made, sharply rebuked her. "You say you can commit no sin." "If my heart is right, I cannot sin," she calmly answered. "Is your heart right?" he asked sneeringly. "I am trying to make it so," gently answered Anne Hutchinson. When a prepared confession was produced, she was directed to read it aloud. She did so in a low voice, and with her head bowed. But her confession contained little more than the 2 facts, that she had misinterpreted the Bible, and had made some unkind remarks about the clergy. For these faults she asked the prayers of those assembled, admitting that the root of all was the height and pride of my spirit. To this one of her accusers shouted at her, "You have stepped out of your place. You have been rather a husband than a wife, a preacher than a hearer, and a magistrate than a subject." Another cried out at her, "You set yourself in the room of God above them, that you might be extolled, and admired," and followed after, "Your iniquity hath found you out." The elders called again for her excommunication. Her English vicar, John Cotton, transferred the task of pronouncement to Pastor Wilson. "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and in the name of the Church, I do cast you out," he said sternly. "I do deliver you up to Satan. I do account you from this time forth to be a heathen, and a publican, and so to be held of all the brethren, and sistern. I command you in the name of Christ Jesus, and of this church as a leper to withdraw yourself out of this congregation." As she left the church, cultivated, charitable, spiritually sensitive, Anne Hutchinson turned, and said, "The Lord judgeth not as man judgeth." Better to be cast out of the church than to deny Christ. 2 days after being cast out of the First Church of Boston, Anne Hutchinson was directed by Governor Winthrop to be gone within a week from Massachusetts Bay. As she left to join her husband and children in Rhode Island, she remembered God's promise. "Fear not, for I am with thee." With child before the trial began, and now with that child growing heavier within her, she pressed on to the frontier in Rhode Island. Her last child, the 16th, was born on Aquidneck, not many miles from Providence, where Roger Williams was settled. The trials and anxieties of the months before had affected her health, and her baby was stillborn. Soon she renewed her lectures and her healing ministrations, but her troubles were not over. Her Massachusetts Bay persecutors sent a delegation to Rhode Island to make inquiries and to warn the church against Anne Hutchinson. They interviewed her husband, Chief Magistrate of Rhode Island, and tried to influence him against his own wife, but he retorted, "I am more nearly tied to my wife than to the church. She is a dear saint and a servant of God." When Anne's Boston enemies asked permission to address her church at Portsmouth, they were refused. When they made a personal call at the Hutchinson home, saying they came from the Lord and the church, she asked, "Which Lord do you mean? There are Lords many, and gods many, but I acknowledge but one Lord. Your church is not the church of Christ." Her opponents even threatened the validity of the titles of the Hutchinson property in Rhode Island, and imprisoned her son Francis, who had remained a member of the Boston Church. They also threatened to take her back to Boston, which would have meant prison, or the lash. Her sister Catherine Scott, described as a grave, sober and ancient woman, and the mother of many children, was later subjected to indignity by the exposure of her person in public, and cruel punishment by the lash. Anne Hutchinson became so terrorized that her family talked of leaving Rhode Island and going farther into the wilderness. As she was planning to leave, she lost her husband, her devoted companion of 30 years. His death prompted her to make an even hastier departure from Rhode Island, which had been her home for 4 years. She chose the distant territory of New Amsterdam, where she would be under the protection of the Dutch, and where her persecutors from Massachusetts Bay could oppress her no longer. There were 2 ways of reaching this new frontier. One was to travel 130 miles over an inland route, the other was to go by water in a crude craft. She chose the latter, and in the late summer of 1642, she and her family landed at Flushing, Long Island, and chose a home site at Verdeland, near the present Pelham, New York. This was an area where the Indians had conspired to destroy all white settlers, but Anne assumed that if her family treated the Indians well, they would be as friendly as those in the Rhode Island area. She remembered again, "The Lord bid me not fear." On a summer evening, a year after her arrival, the Indians entered her home and killed her, 6 younger members of her family, and 2 members of the household. These included her daughter Anne, about 18, and Anne's husband, William Collins, another daughter Catherine, 15, Mary, 16, a son Francis, about 21, and another son William, 12, as well as a house servant and farmhand. The blackened ruin of Anne Hutchinson's home was her tomb, but her seed was not destroyed. It was all as God had said to her. "I will not make a full end of thee." Her 9-year-old Susanna, who had been captured by the Indians in the raid, remained unharmed, and was released to her own people 14 years later. Anne's son Richard was safe in England. Her son Edward had remained in the Boston home. Her daughter Bridget was married to John Sanford, who became president of Rhode Island in 1653. Her grandson Peleg Sanford led the colony of Rhode Island from 1680 to 1683. Anne's granddaughter Susanna, the child of her son Edward, married Nathaniel Coddington, son of William Coddington, one of the founders of the colony of Rhode Island, and at various times its governor. Her great-great-grandson Thomas Hutchinson was the last royal deputy governor of Massachusetts, and the author of a history of the colony. Her faithful son-in-law Thomas Savage was later commander-in-chief of the Massachusetts forces in King Philip's War. In 1904, 266 years after the First Church of Boston had excommunicated Anne Hutchinson for heresy, a tablet was affixed to the building, bearing the following inscription. This tablet is placed here in honor of Anne Hutchinson, born in Lincolnshire, England, about 1592, received into membership of this church 1634, banished from Massachusetts by decree of court 1637, killed by the Indians at Pelham, New York 1643, a breeder of heresies, of ready wit and bold spirit. She was a persuasive advocate of the right of independent judgment. The principles of civil liberty, and religious freedom, for which Anne Hutchinson pioneered, were written into the Constitution of the United States. The spirit of Anne Hutchinson, the first woman preacher, and the first fearless defender of religious freedom in New England, survived her persecution and death.